Hello, everyone, and welcome to Not Gnostic, episode 13. I am joined this time by Abby.
Yes, I'm back. The last time we recorded and we interviewed Chris, I was actually not a part of that interview, unfortunately. But it seemed like it went really well.
It did go very well, and there's, I think, a lot of stuff we can unpack with that interview, and I believe that is where we are going to take today's discussion. Before we do, I would like to apologize for actually not uploading last week. Abby and I were actually both busy this time around. I am in the process of job hunting, and I was pretty just dead tired last week, so apologies. And also, Abby is currently next to a train station somewhere in Tokyo right now. So if you do hear the occasional screech of those brakes, I really apologize. I will try to take those out when I'm talking, but when Abby's talking, that's probably going to be impossible. So, again, apologies for that, guys. But thank you. Yeah, for staying tuned. Yeah, living in Japan, it has its benefits, but I also live next to a busy road, and
yes,
so
there are lots of unwanted sounds at certain times of the day.
There are very many, especially when the walls are pretty much made out of what I think is styrofoam.
Styrofoam or paper, even.
Styrofoam or paper, but hey, it's cheap and I can live on my own, so I guess you gotta take what you can get in that regard. So
right.
Yes. And so for today's episode, we were going to unpack what I discussed with Chris, because we had a lot of interesting things to talk about. And so the main, I guess, overarching theme of today's episode is going to be like, how can people fill the void after leaving something like Christianity or, Hinduism, Buddhism, Muslim, whatever religion you come from? How do you fill the void? I mean, there's just so much to unpack there, because when you are in a religion, you are a part of a community, you are a part of something that you personally think is great. And then you leave because, you come to the conclusion that it's not something you can believe anymore. And all of that seems to disappear. So I think we want to unpack that and really figure out where people might be able to take their spirituality, if you think spirituality is a thing, or perhaps your own philosophy even. Because as I said in the last episode, atheism in and of itself does not offer anything. It doesn't offer a worldview. All it describes is someone who does not believe in God. Chris's spirituality was influenced by LaVeyan Satanism, and it was really interesting to me, I think. He explained a lot of the misconceptions, which we will also be going into misconceptions about certain things today in this episode. And so when it comes to finding spirituality after deconversion, I think it's important to look at the question, why some people need routine or some sort of dogma to direct their life. And Abby and I were, discussing this before the podcast. We got on, Google Documents and started typing this out. But so what are your thoughts on that, Abby, just to get us warmed up?
Well, just probably, off the cuff and from my own heart, I think that sometimes people want to make meaning out of things in their life that may seem difficult or hard. When we lose a loved one or we lose something in our lives that matter to us, we want to have a reason for that beyond just, humans die.
Yeah.
And so I think that when we add some sort of spiritual element to our lives for whatever reason, to help us practice a safer life, a healthier life, or to help us cope with things that are very hard, like depression or death, things like this, it creates this sort of nice, quaint little thing for each individual.
Definitely.
And I think it is a big reason why. I mean, we are, meaning-making people. We want there to be meaning in things, even if there isn't any meaning.
Exactly.
So I think that's probably a big reason why, ultimately. And I think that no one's really susceptible from that, because I think everybody, no matter where they are on some spiritual spectrum or what they believe spiritually, or what they practice spiritually. That's really the ultimate cause of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. People want meaning. Even as an atheist, right? People will say that there doesn't have to be meaning in life. And I completely agree with that. I don't think there needs to be meaning to this existence. Like, this existence could be completely random. And I am totally fine with that. It could have no meaning whatsoever. I am fine with that. But at the end of the day, sometimes I still find myself thinking, staring up at that ceiling at night, and I just find myself thinking, what is the fucking point of it all? Like, we work like slaves for the rest of our lives. Okay, that's a bit of a dramatic explanation, I think. But I mean, we work our entire lives, right? And then we just die like that, right? It just seems anticlimactic, Like, what are we supposed to do? Like, where do we take our existence? How do we have an impact on the world? And religion, I think, really gives us that sort of ability to have an impact on the world. It makes us believe that we can be part of something important. And when you lose that, it's just really, like, it's easy to have an existential crisis in that regard. And it's hard to adjust, I think, for people after losing religion.
So what do you think then, and I know you've done some research on this, so I think you can expand on this, but what do you think then is kind of the cause of why religion maybe plays just a massive role within society, but also within just our own individual lives post-deconversion? Where does all that stem from?
I think a lot of it stems from the unknown, first off. There's a lot of explanations, I think, for it, but definitely the unknown. The fear of death is a big one for religion. And, it's like we want there to be something after death. We want continuation. A lot of people can't come to terms with the idea of just not existing after death. Even I struggle with it still. I think to myself, is it really possible for me to stop existing? If I am here right now, I am aware of everything. Wouldn't that mean somehow that consciousness continues into death after life?
Right, of course.
Because, I mean, if we just disappeared, at least this is how, my thought process is. If we just disappear after this life, then wouldn't I just constantly be in a state of unawareness? Like, I would never know who I really am or something like that.
Right.
But the fact that I know now, it's really hard to explain how consciousness could just disappear like that and how I would just stop existing. I mean, people say, think back to before you were born. Do you remember any pain? No. Do you remember any agony? No. At the same time, though, I don't remember any happiness either. It's just, I don't remember anything before that. I can't even tell you. I can't even tell you what my earliest memory is, because you go that far back and it just sort of becomes a clusterfuck of
you don't
whatever.
Really start developing memories, I think, until around 2 or 3.
I mean, I remember my earliest memory
later.
might be in the nursery before I could even form words in my mouth, but I just remember feeling like very emotional when my dad came to come get me. That's it. All I feel is like the emotion from that memory. I don't remember thinking anything. And that's my earliest memory. At least I think it's a memory. I mean, maybe it's just my brain fucking with me. But life is very much like a dream, and that's getting way off topic into something else. But
so I guess besides the idea of death, and besides the idea of fear of loss of human consciousness or the continuation of human consciousness, which is a massive part of religions across the board.
And I was just sorry for
what are some other reasons why we have religion, or why religion has existed?
Thank you, Abby, for keeping us on track, because I was going on a very long sort of ramble there. Thank you for pulling us back in. So the fear of death, like I said. Another one, that I guess sort of stems from back in the day, from like thousands of years ago. Okay, we're going like really back. One idea people would probably play around with is that people needed government. And religion sort of filled that need. Organization, rules, things to abide by. And I think religion played its part back in the day. I really do. It helps people strive towards a certain goal. You know, it has the potential to lead to survival. You know, now we have government, now we have things, and I am not an expert. You know, maybe government came before religion. It could very well be like the chicken before the egg kind of thing, or vice versa. I am not sure which came first, but religion certainly has community that comes along with it, and I think that's very important. That's another reason why people need, or maybe they might feel the need to have religion in their life. Now, the one that I really want to touch upon is the idea of self-control. Okay, so I'm going to read a couple things from an article I found on the psychologicalscience.org website, and it's called "Why Do We Have Religion Anyway?" That is the title. And so basically in this, they sort of conduct experiments that all revolve around self-control. They have people who are not religious participate in the experiments, and people who are religious participate in the experiments. They use religiously primed words to invoke certain cognitive abilities within the participants to see if that has any sort of effect on self-control and things like that. So basically, researcher Kevin Rounding and his colleagues, the article writes, are arguing that the primary purpose of religious belief is to enhance the basic cognitive process of self-control, which in turn promotes any number of valuable social behaviors. So self-control in religion, I mean, I think for me personally, this is an obvious one, right? You hear testimonies, at least I did. You probably did too when you were a Christian, Abby. But we often heard testimonies in church of alcoholics who were suddenly touched by God or something, and they, you know, suddenly overcame their addiction. People who were smokers overcame their addiction. People who were drug addicts, pornography addicts. You know, it covers a wide range of people with different types of addictions. They all claimed to have been touched by the Spirit of God and to overcome their addiction. They were given, quote unquote, self-control, basically. So I think religion for many people does offer a faucet for self-control. Now, getting on to the experiment, I think it's really interesting. So in the first experiment, they conducted 4 of these experiments, and they used measures of self-control. In the first experiment, participants were asked to drink a mix of orange juice and vinegar, which sounds like it tastes like shit. I've never actually had it. Have you ever had OJ and vinegar, Abby?
Not mixed together.
Well, separately.
Possibly, you know.
Yeah, I've had it separately. They both shine in their respective disciplines, I guess. But so they were paid. So the participants who drank this mixture were paid more for each ounce of the brew that they drank. The more they drank, the more they exhibited self-control. It was found that those who were religious drank more than those who weren't. So a second experiment was delayed gratification. And I think this one is a very common kind of experiment with regards to this. But participants were given $5 and they were told that the experiment had ended. You know, they could go home and do everything. In reality, the experiment was still going on. They were then told that they could come back the next day for another $5 immediately, right? Or they could wait until the week after and come back for, wait for it, $6. So you would be $1 richer. And so the religious people were actually found, those who had religion on their minds, as the article puts it, were found to be more likely to wait until the next week for the bigger reward. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the third experiment involved impossible puzzles that the volunteers were asked to complete. There were 4 control groups in this one: depleted but religiously primed, undepleted controls, and religiously primed controls. The depleted term refers to ego depletion, which is when the mind and brain becomes fatigued and self-control impaired. You know how muscles become fatigued. The mind, naturally, also can become fatigued. I don't know, after a long day of, like, practicing mindful meditation, I've found my brain to just be, totally exhausted. Or after doing lots of math or some kind of difficult problem. You know, that kind of feeling where you just cannot think and you just want to veg out in front of, the TV or whatever at the end of a hard day. The results showed that of those who were depleted, the ones that were religiously primed lasted longer on the impossible task, indicating that perhaps religious priming restored their cognitive abilities. The performance between them and those who never tried out in the first place, or who never tired out, pardon my words there, in the first place remained the same. The scientists take this as strong evidence for the replenishing effect of religion on self-discipline. So there seems to be a connection here between how religion can basically not force people, but I guess in a way force people, right, to go beyond their normal limits, what they would normally do, in a sense. Now, one of the more, or perhaps the most interesting experiment, I think, is the fourth experiment. Now, in order to rule out that the religious priming, where people were told religious words or things of that nature, was not affecting the tasks, or as they sort of put it, activating something else like moral intuition or death-related concerns, like the afterlife, hell, heaven, things of that nature. The scientists in the fourth experiment, they used a secular self-controlled task, one with no moral sort of overlay, this so-called, Stroop task. In the Stroop task, participants are required, for those of you who are listening who may not have heard of the Stroop task, participants must rapidly identify the ink in the words that are printed in rather than read the words. So this is actually a very difficult task and needs mental exertion and self-control. Religious words, naturally, were still used, but other moral words were included as well, like virtue, righteous, and others that dealt with mortality, as in deadly or grave. The results were unexpected and showed that religiously primed volunteers had much more self-control than did controls or those primed to think about mortality. However, those with religion on their minds were statistically no different than those with morality on their minds. It suggests that activating an implicit moral sensibility may have some of the same effect as religion. Now, I found this interesting just because we see the problem of morality in religion all the time. And
right.
To see how morality can work the same way or in similar ways as a sort of cognitive function as religion in the mind to replenish certain cognitive abilities, I think is very interesting.
Right.
It is, though, unclear that what cognitive mechanism is related to the religion's influence on self-control, naturally. But, ideas might be that perhaps when religious words are used, for example, religious words like cross or something, scripture, holy, things like that. When those are used, perhaps it invokes something in the mind, like perhaps the fear of death, maybe, or perhaps, maybe someone's reputation is a driving force in this as well. Perhaps religion has some kind of effect on that. And so another reason why people would need, I think, dogma or religion in their lives is because self-control is clearly linked with religion, or at least there's
right.
a correlation between greater self-control and religious behavior, I think.
Right, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, in a lot of ways, even though we might be able to feel like we can control some stuff, sometimes maybe experiencing or trying to fill the void with some sort of outside source,
mm-hmm.
spiritual or not spiritual, to help us maintain self-control in areas of our life that could be deemed very toxic, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, things like that aren't necessarily healthy choices, regardless if you're a Christian or not.
Yeah.
They're just not good for your body.
Right. They're not. They're not. I mean,
so, if we want to have self-control in our lives for those that struggle with those things, outside sources can be really helpful. Sometimes that is a spiritual source.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
It is interesting.
Before becoming atheist, I always considered going to church the better alternative to what, other people my age were doing, like going out partying, having drugs, drinking, stuff like that. Now I kind of feel like I missed out, but that's beyond the point. So it's like I considered it a healthier aspect. And really, I mean, if you think about it, you're not poisoning yourself with, alcohol. You're not dirtying your lungs with tobacco. So, I mean, it must be a healthier alternative. Then again, you could just as easily replace that, I feel like, with secular activities too.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, self-control definitely is a major aspect. Self-discipline is a major aspect of religion, especially in Christianity, where you need to be disciplined enough to put God above everything else in your life. You need to,
right.
And here we start to get into what I talked about with Chris, right? How when he was describing LaVeyan Satanism and, the concept of the self, of how important the self is in LaVeyan Satanism, and not necessarily in like a selfish way, but the self is important. You, as an individual, are important. And Christianity, it pretty much idolizes self-sacrifice. And when in doing so, you sacrifice the self so much that I think people begin to wonder who they really are within the religion. Mm-hmm. And from this self-sacrifice, I think many insecurities arise. I had to deal with a lot of insecurities, I think, as a Christian. I often thought that I was better than everyone else, which is another hallmark of what we talked about in an earlier episode, cult-like behavior. And it just wasn't a healthy way for me spiritually, like having all of these insecurities about who I was. And I always felt like I was sort of, I guess, dehumanizing myself, calling myself worthless, that I'm not worthy of what God has supposedly done for me in my life. And that leads to very unhealthy thoughts, I think.
Right.
And when it comes to the self, I really resonated with the idea of LaVeyan Satanism, to be honest, and how Chris sort of defined how he looked at it. He took a different approach, I think, than your typical LaVeyan Satanist might, which I think is great. I think, people being able to define who they are post-religion is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he described LaVeyan Satanism, to me, was more about spirituality than actual religion, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Just the way he described it, he enjoyed the theater aspect of it, putting on robes, doing the rituals. It wasn't about the religion. It was about what he personally enjoyed. And I think that resonated very well with me. And I feel like spirituality should be about what you enjoy, how you can improve yourself.
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what are your thoughts on spirituality, Abby?
Well, let's talk about it. I think maybe the first place I want to talk about, the first thing I want to consider before we, because we've kind of talked about what has been taken out possibly out of our lives when we leave a spiritual community. Right. Which could be ideas of how we deal with death, how we deal with self-control, which are, any number of things.
Yeah.
But we also have to think about why the void is created too, and why deconverts feel the need to fill their life with something.
Yeah.
So, and one thing that came out of the interview with Chris, you guys talked about crowd hysteria in religion.
Yeah.
And it's kind of this question of, how do just such a few people become so convinced of a certain truth or certain thing being real?
Yeah.
And mass hysteria is a phenomenon that, transmits collective illusions of threats, whether real or imaginary, through a population and society as a result of rumors or fear. And there are so many examples of this. The Salem witch trials, the Red Scare, the Mothman, fear of Islamic terrorism.
Yes.
And we can't necessarily claim whether all these things are true or not true, essentially, because we're skeptics, me and you both. I mean, I kind of would stand that, the Salem witch trials is a bunch of bullshit, in terms of what took place in that community.
Yeah.
The Mothman is a really, really interesting thing, because you had this creature showing up whenever bad things are about to happen.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. The Red Scare, we can't deny the existence of, Islamic terrorism or, communism, but ultimately, like, those two things have also produced mass hysteria within society in ways that aren't necessarily true. You know, people are afraid. We're afraid of communists, or they were, you know, blaming people for being communists through McCarthyism and Islamic, which is the same as Salem witch trial, essentially. And, you know, Islamic terrorism, you know, these days, you know, people are like, just basically associate terrorism with Islam, which is not true at all. I mean, we can look at the recent things that have happened in Charlottesville, and I mean, there's white terrorism right there.
Well,
the you know, resurgence of the KKK and the Nazi Party.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here, but this is just examples of mass hysteria within society. People of being afraid of these small groups, whether they existed or not. You know,
and it's and you know, the disaster thing, in my opinion, is particularly interesting. You know, we watched the Mothman documentary earlier, and it touched on that. And, you know, I've listened to Astonishing Legends, where they talked about the Mothman. And they have a lot of very, in my opinion, convincing stories and experiences to tell. Whether or not there's any legitimacy to them, I can't say. I will not claim to know anything in this. And like you said, we are both skeptics. I would love to believe in this stuff, but I have not had any of my experiences of my own. In my case, this is a thing that really takes the whole seeing is believing thing to the next level, because I need to see it to believe it. But I digress. So when it comes to, like, I guess just all of these things, like, it's really interesting how disaster is often, like, associated with them, you know, and how people need to blame something on disaster. Like, they have to find a scapegoat. And I feel like when it comes to the supernatural, it's really, really easy to pin the scapegoat on something you don't know about. You know what I mean? Right. So
yeah, exactly. Well, and we talk about kind of mass hysteria within church, which is a small community, you know, like Salem or something like that. You know, think Jonestown and the paranoia that's existed in that small community. Yep. It's very important to consider that the feelings produced in church, in a church service, maybe a Christian church service, because that's our background, even though those might be positive experiences, they're masked in mass hysteria.
They are.
The idea of a scapegoat, like, okay, like, we're not necessarily talking about a bad thing. In terms of Jonestown, they were blaming, like, the government and all these other things.
Yeah.
And, you know, Jim Jones was an extremely paranoid person.
Definitely.
But when we talk about just your average whatever, you just go to church, you know, there is a mass hysteria thing happening within that community. And because everyone believes it's real, you know, it's a confined space. And if you look at something long enough, it becomes, you know, very true.
It does.
I mean, Plato's allegory of the cave, the Truman Show, the Matrix, all of these things talk about this idea of what's real and how we perceive realness.
Yeah.
And so all of that's kind of just the underlying ideology, or basically what I think and I feel is why.
Yeah.
You know, why mass hysteria is created within religion.
Okay.
Or, you know, in the church.
Yeah. And so when it comes to the void left by religion, what do you think creates that sort of gap? Is it just
I think
a culmination of things? Like,
I think it's a massive amount of things, you know. I think it's the hysteria, the highness that you get from that. You know, Chris talked about just how it felt great to be part of something good. Yeah. And, you know, you're all working together towards a common goal. It's the same reason why people become fans of sports.
Oh, yeah.
You know, we all want the ball to get into the end zone. If it gets into the end zone, we all freak out. And we become very massive parts of that. It's a cult-like behavior. Yeah. You know, and so I think that also is why, because we are part of such a strong community. And, you know, unfortunately, there are behaviors within cults that we understand that are very bad, but those are the things that become so structured in us that sometimes when we leave, we have to find new crutches to help us kind of get off of that idea and really kind of find ourselves. You know, it's the whole pyramid scheme. There's someone always at the top, you know. A lot of stuff happens within closed doors. There's rules you have to follow. We all kind of want rules to follow in our own personal lives after we leave. So that's a reason why a void's created. Learning to progress. You know, you have to progress in your community.
Yeah.
You're not
and then
always,
you lose that when you leave. Like, you lose all of that progression. You lose that. You know?
Yes, exactly. You lose the allure of maybe having an unlimited power or some sort of, thing that you felt was real, within the spiritual community of being filled with the Holy Spirit or speaking in tongues or praying for people or prophesying and seeing the future, visions, things like this. That's a massive part of that, spiritual, and Protestantism.
It does feel better actually knowing, at least thinking, right, that there is someone upstairs as powerful as God watching over your life, like
exactly.
You don't have to be in control. That's the thing. You don't have to be in control of everything to have a good life. God is in control. He knows everything. Everything's okay. Everything's fine. That's what you tell yourself when you're a Christian.
Right.
And then when you become atheist, suddenly you realize that you are in control of everything. You are in control of your own life, And that is a very scary thought for a lot of people, I think. Suddenly, like, things you thought maybe you were forgiven for, you actually weren't forgiven for, and you need to go back and fix those things yourself. You can't just get out of jail free card, by praying to God. You need to go to that person and be like, hey man, I'm sorry. I know for a fact there are people I need to apologize to still.
Right. Fix the
conflict for my time as a Christian. And it was such a scary thought, like when I became an atheist, thinking that, wow, I am in control of everything now. All of a sudden, suddenly I went to
it's under your control.
Suddenly I went to having no control to having full control, and it's powerful. It's a really powerful thing, but at the same time, I'm just like completely overwhelmed. And I think
so. Now, in your own life, how important is spirituality for your well-being?
I think it's very important. I really do, personally. I know a lot of atheists will probably just gloss over spirituality and say you don't need any of that mumbo jumbo in quotation marks. But to be honest, I think there is a very positive benefit to spirituality, being spiritual. Focus, because it's not just about supernatural bullshit,
Right.
And,
exactly.
And I mean, I want to believe in the supernatural. I think there are many things we can't explain, but at the same time, it's like, spirituality does not have to mean God. It does not have to mean you believe in spirits. It doesn't have to mean that stuff. And
I totally
think
agree.
That's a big misconception some people have about spirituality. Spirituality to me means like I will focus more on practicing mindful meditation, for example.
Right.
I will be mindful of my surroundings. I will, focus on maybe what sort of conflicts are causing me mental strain or mental stress.
Right.
Meditation, when I talk about meditation, I'm not talking about aligning your fucking chakras so that you can like astral project into the next realm or some shit. I'm just talking about grounding yourself in reality, really, to be honest.
Right.
And
which is great.
Really recognizing the importance you are, like how important you yourself are and how your actions can affect other people, clearing their mind and things like that. Real down-to-earth things that have no new age, nonsensical spiritual crap attached to it. That to me is spirituality.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that spirituality is probably important for my well-being, but I think that for those out there that feel like it's not important post-faith, I think that you have to change your definition of spirituality. It's not the toxic place that you probably came from, from whatever faith community that you were part of. It's much bigger and much more complex than the small, isolated communities that we came from.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's ultimately, it's a practice, some sort of practice that we create or we get from others or other ideologies or beliefs or thoughts where we basically practice transcendence beyond ourselves. Mm-hmm. Through some sort of medium or person or group or book or doctrine or dogma or whatever to help us, and there's actually benefits to it.
Yeah,
there's actually benefits to it.
Yeah, there are benefits.
I was looking at this article from the University of Minnesota, and it talked about what you've talked about earlier, meditation and prayer. Contemplative practice is good for you. That's the first thing
what?
The article points out.
Yeah, and the benefit of prayer is an interesting topic to touch upon because you lose that too when you That's, I think, another piece of the void that you lose when you leave Christianity. Yeah. No longer do you have someone to talk to about your most intimate problems,
Right. Well, a spiritual community can really improve your life.
It can. But at the same time, I've hit some lows since my deconversion. I mean, I had surgery twice in 1 year. That's not fun. 6 months, really. And I hit some lows during that time, and I found it helped immensely, by the way, to just talk to myself about shit. I didn't have to talk to God. I didn't start anything by saying, "Dear Fatherly Heaven who exists, please, watch over me," or whatever. And now my prayer skills just suck really bad right now. When I was a Christian, I sounded way more holy, but
"Dear Heavenly Father who exists,"
whatever, who exists, as if I need to convince myself of his existence while I'm a believer.
Well, you are. We're doing it every time we pray.
Dear Heavenly Father who exists. Okay, anyways, so I didn't have any holy rhetoric in anything that I said, but something interesting. And, it's funny, when we watch the whole George Carlin religion is bullshit thing, he touches on this, when I prayed by myself, or not prayed, but just talked to myself, I got the same feelings I did in prayer as I did just talking to myself,
Right.
I found the same amount of relief, it just helps to talk about your shit, no matter whether it's to your mom or to no one or to God, quotation marks there. But it's just, I wanted to just talk about that because prayer is interesting. Having spirituality doesn't have to involve anything to do with God or anything like that. I think what spirituality is in its outset is just making you a better person. And yes, I think there's some overlap there with religion. Definitely religion also claims to try to make you a better person, be nice, be kind, do all of those things, those are teachings in the Bible. And give to others is another one that the Bible preaches and things like that. Well, that they interpret it as preaching, I guess. But so it's just, I think you're right when you say that there's a lot of things that are left behind.
Well, so the next benefit would be a spiritual community.
Yeah.
I argue that any community, no matter its form, can be good for your life. It doesn't necessarily be a spiritual one. It can be if you want it to be.
Yeah.
And anything really could probably be made into a spiritual community. But so we have to view spirituality very loosely in this, but that community, you lose out on that,
You do.
And so not only, contemplative practice is good, you're no longer maybe practicing contemplation the way you used to. You have to replace that contemplation. That's very healthy. And you have to find a community that you can fit in. This type of podcast, this type of discussion.
Yes. And,
it has helped us.
It has really helped us. I can't begin to describe how much talking with Abby weekly about this stuff has helped. Some weeks we can't, like last week, but it has just helped so much. We were doing it so much, from the beginning, right? Each week we would just talk about things, and I've shared things with you that I've never shared with anyone else. And it's just really helpful having someone there, and
it is.
It's really helpful, and being involved in a community, some kind of community. And again, it does not have to be a spiritual community. When it comes to filling that void, you can fill it with anything. Literally, like I said before, you are in complete control over your life now, post-religion. You can, join academic things, what's your hobby? If you like coding, you can join an online meetup for coding or something. And if you are a spiritual person, maybe you want to get into meditation, maybe you want to join certain groups. There are free thinking atheist groups or secular groups out there too, and when it comes to philosophy, we talked about philosophy briefly in the last episode with Chris, where we touched upon humanism as well. But I think that humanism is a very good way to go, as well with regards to where do you want to take your personality and your beliefs next? I feel like that's the next step after, after deconverting and all of that, because after deconverting, you may find yourself confused. You may find yourself at a complete loss as to what to do next. And, I see this on forums all the time, on, ex-Christian, Muslim, just ex-faith, I guess, forums. And people are like, so what do I do now? You know, like,
Right.
are there any other churches or organizations like churches? The biggest thing, I think, really is the community. That, hands down, is the biggest thing about religion, I think, personally. And that is the void you feel when you leave, you know, because... Yeah, especially losing God, too, you know, not having someone to talk to, and those things really just, I think, you can fill with other, you know, things that aren't geared towards religion or anything like that. So,
well, it's you know, this article from the University of Minnesota claims that spiritual strength can help you overcome hardships.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And sometimes we need that external force to make us feel okay.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't necessarily need to come from an organized religion. I mean, once again, spirituality is a very wide thing. And you study anything that people over the centuries have made spiritual, or some sort of idea that you want to make part of your spiritual life. Yeah. And I think it becomes something that helps you replace that community when you're not ready to find it. Mm-hmm. You know, I guess I've been rambling a little bit about all the benefits, but if we can get through this list, that way we don't necessarily need to break down them all.
Of course.
But, you know, it talks about spiritual people, you know, make healthier choices. I think there's evidence for that. Yeah. I mean, having rules can help you have a better diet or improve lifestyle
Self-control
choices.
Comes down to that again.
Self-control is a massive part of that. And spirituality to help you live longer.
And you don't need religion for self-control either, okay? Like,
Exactly.
I was nearly obese when I first came to Japan. In fact, I probably crossed that line a couple times, you know? And then I looked at myself and I realized this needs to stop. And I lost, 20 kilograms. This was post-deconversion. Right. So, and that's about 40 pounds for those of you who are on a different system. But, and I've kept it off since then, and it's all about management, self-control. And, there's really nothing, I guess, spiritual about it, but I still managed to do that. So,
but there is. I would argue that there is, because we want to have resources that help us deal with any number of things. Right. Anything negative that we might perceive negative in our life: grief, guilt, unforgiveness, right? Self-rejection, self-esteem levels. We want to deepen ourselves and make sure that we're okay mentally. And I think spirituality plays a big role in it. And I think that when we want to make something spiritual, it's something that we're trying to transcend beyond ourselves, right? So I think that really spirituality is something that doesn't necessarily leave us. I think it's a part of the human
experience
story and the human experience. And I don't think that we should necessarily throw that out there. I think that we have to be careful what we define as real. But then again, that's also really difficult.
It's subjective. So reality is subjective.
It's very subjective. We have what is scientific and we understand that. But we have to look beyond that. We still need mythos in our lives. Yeah. That's why we want to tell stories. That's why we go to the movies. Yeah. We want to have something that's beyond
our existence.
Just our existence and how we can explain it maybe scientifically these days better than we ever could. But we want to still have something to hold on to. And honestly, why not? In that regard, I'm okay with a lot of things.
Yeah, definitely.
And I know that's a little off tangent from
not
what
at
you're
all.
talking about with your weight loss, but I would just argue that for yourself, that was something that helped you.
It was.
And so,
it definitely, it does. It helps with my image. It helps with how I perceive myself. I have more confidence in my life now, because I look at myself every day and I think I look good. I don't think negative thoughts.
Yeah, which is great. That's a powerful thing to have.
It is.
That's a very powerful thing to have.
And I think, when it comes to religion, I remember thinking more negative thoughts about myself than I do now, personally. And so I think when you attach so many rigid rules to things like spiritual growth, that it can become a negative kind of thing, which I think is what religion really is. When you boil it down to it, it's people who maybe started out spiritual and then decided to attach a bunch of rules to it, to maybe make it seem more legitimate. I don't know why they would do that.
Right.
But, and so, did you have anything else on the list to talk about here?
No, ultimately, I think that's the list.
Okay.
But I really ultimately am just trying to make a point that, you know, we are a part of something, we leave it, and I think that we've talked about this through a few episodes, but I think we finally have kind of gotten down to a big reason, and we've actually put down in an episode now that's very centralized and brings together some of these big ideas we've been talking about in the 13 episodes.
And I'm really liking how it's coming around because, you know, we are finally answering some of these questions, you know, and I think being able to sort of break down certain interviews and certain concepts has helped a lot in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a phenomenal interview with Chris. I listened to it because I missed that episode. I was not a part of it, and that's why I wanted to unpack these things when we were going through our show notes and getting ready for this.
And that's why generally, you know, I like to do every other week where it's like we do one where you and I just talk, and then we do an interview, because then we can unpack anything maybe we've talked about, or we might choose an entirely different topic, of course, but you know, and sometimes I'll just upload, you know, 2 interviews in a row, or maybe 2 of our shows in a row. But ultimately, you know, I think it's great. Like, I feel like we're almost creating our own little community doing this podcast, you know?
Yeah.
And like,
well, we are, you know, and totally.
And what I want to do actually is in a future episode is it's going to be an editing nightmare, but I want to get everyone that we've talked to into one episode and have just a massive discussion about atheism, religion, about post experiences and things of that nature, just to see.
That would be.
I
really
think that
awesome
would be great.
That would be.
I think that would be fantastic, and so that's something that's in the works. Of course, managing time zones. You and I live in Japan. That's going to be a pain in the ass.
Yes.
If anyone listening to this show, if you guys would be interested in, you know, coming on, please feel free to send us an email. I still have a ton of emails that I need to work through. It's really hard setting up dates and times, especially between, you know, job hunting and working and, you know, life things. But please keep the emails coming, because we do want to interview you, and we really value each person that comes on this show, and it just makes it more lively, I think. So, but I think, and I don't know what you're doing on screen right now, but I'll just ignore it for now, because that was just weird. But no, I'm kidding. So anyways, thank you guys for listening to episode 13 of Not Gnostic. If you have any questions about the show, maybe you have a point you would like to touch on, again, send us an email at notgnosticpodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to follow us on Twitter, where we currently have an amazing amount of subscribers at 0, you can go ahead and follow us on discussions. I should have not
0 subscribers.
Should I have not said that? I probably shouldn't have said that. Now we're going to lose everyone, because, yeah. Anyways, just kidding.
We're trying. Hey, we are trying. We are building our empire from the ground up.
I wouldn't call it an empire. That's a bit crazy.
It's an empire.
It's not an empire.
We're starting a cult. This is Not Gnostic Podcast will be a cult soon,
well, we need to register with the U.S. government first. But, anyway,
tax evasion.
Yay. Oh, I can finally get that mansion I've always wanted. But anyways, guys, thank you for listening.
Bless the Lord.
You can follow us on Twitter at @not_Gnostic if you want, or not. The choice is yours. You have complete control. And thanks for listening. See you next time.